One of the most important things for all of the Red Room Company projects, and especially Unlocked, is to represent as many different poetry styles as you want. And music is something that we've found has obviously been, being the history of poetry, being such a huge part of the programs that we do. Another very large aspect of it is working with visual arts and looking at poetry as visual creations as well. Poems that can be objects that you can stitch and make, but how you can form stories and narratives and just enjoy language through the making of shapes. And one of the poets who's been integral in exploring that has been Dr. Gareth Jenkins, who's going to talk to you next. Gareth works in all sorts of areas, in particular youth engagement programs across the country, and has been working with the Red Room Company, I think probably for the last 10 years. So Gareth has been there from day one to tell you a little bit about how the program's evolved. I'd like to welcome Gareth.
Hi there. As Joe said, I've been involved in Red Room projects for the last 10 years or so, and I've been involved in Unlock since its inception, and I've co-facilitated 4 of the projects. From very early on, we heard from educators who'd spent many years working in prisons that some of the most striking transformations they'd witnessed in their students had come in conjunction with their exposure to creative expression. Often the expression of others, published people, stories who were deemed worth reading, important. Unlocked was shaped for me and for others around the premise that even the voiceless in our society, particularly the voiceless, need a space to express themselves and be heard. This notion is central to my research over the last 10 years into writers and art makers that exist on the margins of what's conventionally seen as literature or art or communicative self-expression at all. Outsider writing and art, concrete poetry, sound poetry, writing by constraint, invented languages, illegible writing, micro-writing, creative production to come out of mental institutions, to come off the streets, to come out of those deemed mad, and of course to come out of prisons. These interests have led me to have a pretty expansive view of self-expression and poetry, and in all my teaching at universities and schools and youth centres, if I've tried to do one thing, it is expand my students' idea of what poetry is and what it can be. Unlocked was no different, with students exploring more conventional verse forms, but also forms in the margins. Sound poetry, where vocal expression is done without words. Concrete poetry, which in my own practice is designed to remind the viewer that letters are just shapes that we've attached sound to. Our writing exercises were playful, employing images and music and dreams as inspiration, taking other texts as starting points to be reappropriated in homophonic translations where lines of French poetry were transformed through intuition and imagination, text on the navigational techniques of bees, on the practice of hypnosis, poets reflecting on their craft, novels from the mid-1800s transformed through cut-ups and fold-ins and blackouts. This is one example from a student, C.L. Waller. I try to write it in stanzas dusk. The connection has been memory of summer light and fears. I live out of shadow and echoes, a space full of voices moving through cadences. Is something waiting? This question, is something waiting, is someone waiting, was a yearning many of our students felt in their dislocated situation. Unsurprisingly, they felt profoundly cut off in prison from the outside, family, children, themselves, society, and ultimately other inmates as well. We had, of course, set out to create a space within the workshops where students felt safe enough to experiment with language and expose themselves through telling story. This was certainly a challenging task within the prison context, but through empathy, through mutual respect, through poetic creativity and the courage of the students themselves, we often managed to do this very successfully. What we discovered quite quickly was how rare this kind of safe space can be in the prison for many of our students. You don't open up to people in here, there's always someone waiting to use it against you, was a refrain that we heard throughout the projects, certainly the ones that I was involved in. And whilst we never approached the workshops as a kind of therapy, there was an undeniable sense of catharsis at work as the students, week by week, slowly opened themselves to one another and shared what were often stories with which they could really relate. In so doing, they became less cut off from each other and ultimately themselves. I mean, students voiced this directly to us, saying things like, "In 18 years in prison, I've never spoken to someone like this," or expressing that through the writing of a poem about their life, they'd experienced realisations about their underlying motivations, what drove them. This transformative nature of the workshops, along with the students' generosity, enthusiasm, willing to take what were real risks, has made this project some of the most satisfying teaching I've had the pleasure to be involved in. And one last important aspect of the project, as Joanna mentioned, is the creation of its publications. Public expressions of self, tangible evidence that students' work was worth reading, was important, the voiceless given voice, a link between the outside and inside self, a source of pride, an object to hold in the hand, to post to mum, children, friends, husbands, wives. This tension between the inside and outside became a preoccupation of mine in the poems I wrote for the project. I'll finish with one of them that was inspired by workshops we did at Manus Prison near Wagga. It's a working farm, so lacked the razor wire of Silverwater. But when we were there last, the phones had been broken for some time. This inability to make contact with the outside was filling the men with tension and a palpable sadness. They had so many words and nowhere to put them. So much distance. His sky, a double bass cloudscape playing rain. Wet channels in clay strike him. How important a water tank. Echoes of that red wheelbarrow. He rolls hay bales, spirals, tends horsehair scrub. Wild flowers arching hillside, no razor wire for rain to run off. His voice, unbroken by fences, is dismantled by distance. Words clatter, familiar stones piling in pockets. The phones are down, it will soon be Christmas.